and welcome to Two Words Wolves Pod. I'm Ryan Eichten, and it's just me today. Hopping on after the Timberwolves season ends, 124-94 in Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals. You don't need me to tell you that game was a train wreck, basically, from the beginning of the game. Wolves losing by 30. I don't even think do it justice to how bad that game was for them. It's insane that that's not even by a margin of 10 points. That's not even the biggest blowout of this series. So Game 3 of this series will always stand out as a bit of an anomaly in that sense. But yeah, Wolves just don't come out with the requisite attention to detail, energy, whatever word you want to use. They score only 9 points in the first quarter. Just not even close to the requisite what they needed to be competitive in that game. Part of it was missing open shots in the first couple possessions. Jaden McDaniels had like 3 straight looks from the corner. That maybe if those go down, maybe it's different. I mostly doubt it. That they didn't have it. They kind of, and then once it was clear that the game wasn't going to start well, they let go of the rope. It's unfortunate that they weren't able to come out and fight. That was kind of my biggest frustration with that game, is they never gave themselves a chance to win. To obviously coming and winning 3 straight against this Thunder team was likely at best. But it would have been nice, even if you come out, you play well in the first half and it looks similar to games 1 or 2 where you get throttled down the stretch of the game. I think you can live with that, and ultimately, I guess you're gonna have to live with this, whatever abomination this game was. But yeah, a bit frustrating to see it. An overall really good season end like this, and it does have me thinking back to Game 4, where the talk kind of subsequently about that game was about Ant not taking enough shots, not like forcing it like maybe some other superstars of the past have. I kind of reject that notion in the sense of I don't think any superstars, certainly not anymore, but really that kind of idea has always been a bit antiquated. But ultimately, I thought offensive process-wise, and that was the question Dane Moore asked in the locker room, and that kind of got spread around after that game, was about Ant's offensive process, not necessarily his game overall. And I do agree that his process, in the sense of getting off the ball when you need to, doing that sort of stuff, was solid. But every other portion of his game, to me, in Game 4, was not good enough. And I bring that up now, even though we did do a show after that game, kind of mourning the loss of this season. Then I think most people had had come to the realization that they weren't going to win that series, probably sooner even than that, but certainly Game 4 was the nail in the coffin. But I think what I'll remember about this series is Game 4. They have a chance to get back in the series. The NBA Finals is sitting right there. If they win Game 4, they maybe the series is still out of reach. I mean, it's hard to say Game 5 would have gone any different, and if they lost 3 in Oklahoma City, I don't know what grand confidence you'd have in them taking a Game 7 on there. But ultimately, the finals were sitting there on a platter for them, and I thought, especially the way Ant kind of came out of the gates in Game 4, right, and when you compare that to his Game 3 energy, where he was just doing everything, defense, offense, moving without the ball, doing all that stuff right out of the gates in Game 3, and it was just immediately back to gone in Game 4. And it's not obviously only a point at Anthony Edwards, but that is kind of the main takeaway I have, is just whatever that mental thing is, he wasn't able to lock in again for a second straight game of the Western Conference Finals. Right from the beginning, he kind of has this feeling out process for a game, which is often good for a regular season and even the playoffs sometimes. But they needed, and clearly in the series, they needed Ant to be A+ Ant right from the jump, and they just didn't get it. And I don't want to speculate too much about why that is, why Ant isn't able to reach that, the hunger and the fire right from the beginning of the game, and it kind of takes him a while in a game to get there. But I will say, just Ant's 23 years old, and I think what this series and what the Dallas series last year has kind of revealed is, if the only goal is to win the championship, Ant just isn't quite ready for that. As pretty much every young superstar in the history of the NBA, except for Magic Johnson, and even he had Kareem. But at 23 years old, team players just don't lead their teams to championships. I still think the Wolves are in a fantastic path. Regardless of like the Rudy Gobert trade, I think these two Western Conference Finals appearances have been such amazing experiences and will give Ant such a much better chance to the stuff that he's gone through and hasn't been able to do well enough right now. I think these playoff appearances will give him that the experience to be able to, when they do make it back to the Western Conference Finals in a future season, that he is able to gather what he gained from this series and use it in a future series. I think that that's been as important. The number of players that have led their teams as like the 1A player on the to the Western Conference Finals twice, or to any conference finals twice before turning 24, that list is just not very big. Certainly Tatum is the only player, and even he was the 1A leader on the first Eastern Conference team. It's hard to say, but Tatum is the only like current player that's done it. Luka, if you kind of give him one extra year for 25, then Luka is probably another case there. But I mean, Tatum won his title, but like Luka has had a similar kind of journey to Ant in the sense of just not quite being good enough as the 1A superstar to win a title. Specifically in the Boston series, just wasn't good enough defensively, and obviously we saw his first playoff series with the Lakers, kind of similar issues pop up. So that's my biggest takeaway from this Thunder series is just a lot of their guys weren't good enough. They weren't, for Ant, there's certainly like getting on transition and playmaking and all that have been good enough, but I thought his playmaking was great in this series. And maybe some of the mental stuff for the turnovers, like I said, locking in right from the beginning of the game, just wasn't there. And it's not some grand indictment of really anyone on this team or this roster, but they weren't good enough to win the title. And it stinks to feel that way. Maybe there was a point before this West Finals where it seemed like it was going to open up. Certainly, if they would have somehow gotten through the Thunder, you would have liked their chances against Indiana or New York. But this Thunder team is a juggernaut, and maybe that's the other takeaway. When I'm going to say when, technically if, but when the Thunder win the finals, I'm going to have Travis Singleton on, the Sinker Reporter, to really talk about what this OKC journey has been as he covered them for a lot of the years, the Durant years and the post-Durant years. But the timeline for them of, obviously they put together this Durant, Harden, Westbrook team that is phenomenal. They make the West Finals. Actually, Durant is another player. When they made the finals in 2012, Durant was 23 years old, and they had made the West Finals and lost to the champion Mavericks in the year before. So Durant's another player example that at 23 years old made two West Finals, and even outdueled Ant by making the finals. But they lose to LeBron in 2012. Kind of the next few years, they lose, and Durant gets hurt, Westbrook gets hurt. They never really find their footing until 2016. And then Game 6 Klay happens, where Klay Thompson goes nuts in Game 6. They blow a 3-1 lead. Warriors win 2 home games, and then the Game 6 Klay for the Warriors to win that series. And that was the 73-win Warriors, who eventually lost to the Cavs in their own 3-1 deficit. But Durant leaves after that. And so from there, this version of OKC starts to get built. Obviously, they have, following Durant leaving, they have the Westbrook kind of only teams. And I should mention, like, obviously the Harden trade is the big preceding incident where they weren't good enough to beat the Spurs or the Mavs or the whoever else in the Western Conference those years. But the Westbrook trade was obviously the sliding doors moment for them, where likely they win a championship during that run. But they had these Westbrook only teams. Eventually they trained Westbrook for Chris Paul, and they have this fun bubble team They have this fun bubble team as well, but the way they got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is interesting to me. I guess they have the Westbrook only teams, and then they trade for Paul George from Indiana for Oladipo and Sabonis. So it's interesting that Paul George, Indiana used what they got from the Paul George trade to get Tyrese Halliburton, and they're a win away from the finals. And now the Thunder trade Paul George to the Clippers. In addition, the Clippers get Kawhi that summer, and they get SGA, who I don't think anyone thought at that time of year that when they traded for SGA that they would be this good. But they trade for SGA, they get every single Clipper draft pick available to them, and they go into this rebuild. They have a nice year with Chris Paul and SGA and that kind of team that went up against Houston in the bubble. But then they tank for a couple years. Shai misses like half a season in there. And really, they built this thing up incredibly quickly. They draft Jalen Williams and Chet and just every single other seeming draft pick hit, and now they're going to win the title. So it's been an interesting journey for OKC. I do want to dive in more in depthly with Travis about kind of the OKC journey. Obviously, he hasn't been there the past few years. He's been in Minnesota and Houston, but I'm going to have him on when the Thunder win the title about just to kind of go over Oklahoma City. The Wolves, they lose game 5 by a billion points. They come back home and they do exit interviews with us on Thursday morning. So I just want to kind of hop on here again and give you some impression of what the exit interviews were like. I did post an article about that, about my key takeaways. So we'll go over some of that here as well. But first was Mike Conley. I did laugh. He sat down, and the first name on the list on the schedule is Mike Conley. Just kind of classic vet Mike. I'll read what he said about deciding to go first. Not even asked about going first, but he said, "I didn't sleep much. I volunteered to go first. I knew I wouldn't be asleep. I'd probably be up doing something. I got to see my kids this morning before they went off to school. That was my first thing. Might as well come in and knock it out." So classic Mike there. But the biggest thing Mike said about kind of the team improving was kind of doing the little things. And I'm just going to again read his quote. And you guys can go, if you go on the Timberwolves YouTube page, all these interviews are up there. So you can hear my beautiful voice, ask a few questions here and there. But here's what Mike said about improving on the level of like smaller details. I think for individuals, it has to become even more important to them. The details have to become more important to them. Maybe that means studying the game more. Maybe that means doing more individual coaching, taking coaches on the side and getting some individual stuff there. Bringing me aside every now and then and even more often, and just using the minds around you to help grasp certain concepts and certain things about the game. The game is different than when I came up starting to play. It might even be taught different at a younger age, or however they go through the circuits and through college. What I know is a lot different than what they know. You've got to bring them up at a certain standard or a certain level where the non-negotiables are the things that you just do by habit and try, and not something that we have to ask or for them to show them on film 1,000 times. It will be on us as a team to figure that out. I think that's the key quote, probably of everything that was said in these exit interviews. This team just was not good at the smaller details of basketball enough to win against Oklahoma City Thunder that can match their talent and plays like team basketball at a higher level than even they do. Like the turnovers, obviously some of them, or a lot of them, are forced by what Oklahoma City do, but Oklahoma City isn't a great rebounding team, and the Wolves consistently let them grab offensive rebounds. That's just a classic thing. Transition offense for the Wolves, they need to do better with that, which a lot of that is just being reminded to push the ball. I talked about the mental stuff about just being locked in right from the beginning of the game in an important game when the other team's going to try to hit you with a haymaker. All of those little things. A lot of those, not necessarily what I said, but like what Mike said, there are non-negotiables, meaning if you don't do this stuff, we are going to lose, or we're not going to achieve our potential. They are non-negotiable. And I think from Mike's point of view, too many of those non-negotiables were trying to be negotiated. which is just untenable. I guess they papered over it against the Lakers series and against the Warriors series. Obviously, they won those series in 5 games, and they played, I thought, well in both series. Obviously, more so in the Lakers series, but I do think their play in the Warriors series has gone underappreciated. But that's the biggest thing with like the core young guys of the roster, and maybe even the vets too, is more of the smaller things need to be done more consistently and at a better rate. Kind of going off that, Dante DiVincenzo mentioned from him, one of the biggest things was trying to find like shots, like his shots. Basically, he said this year he was just taking the shots that the offense gave him, which is fine, and he had some success with that. But he mentioned like in New York, and he was more mentioning this wasn't a comparison of New York and Minnesota. It was more talking about him coming to the season late and not having like a true training camp like everyone else. But he was mentioned in the New York offense, he knew exactly where his offense and his shots were going to come from. And so I do think if they have, assuming they have Dante back next year, they can try to like hammer home where Dante's shots are going to come from, because the offense, too much for Dante, felt like every time he stepped into the paint, it was going to be a turnover. That type of stuff just needs to get better. Really don't think Dante's ever going to be like a true point guard, but some of the ball handling stuff can be better with him. And I think finding him more consistent shots or more consistent spots on the floor where he gets his offense will help a lot. Chain McDaniels mentioned the officiating, which is interesting because they were kind of denying that as a factor during the series, and he kind of mentioned that, yeah, it did affect them to a certain extent, that they weren't able to let that go. Or he kind of said, which we saw in game 1, where they were like, before the series started, they were even frustrated about the whistle. Like that, the team just needs to kind of grow up in that area and not get so frustrated by it, let it get in their heads. Jaden also mentioned like they want to be closer to the best team in the league defensively when they were kind of in the bottom 6. Chris Finch mentioned that as well, about their on-ball pressure was just not consistent enough throughout the season. They need to do better with on-ball pressure so the defense, the defense was good this year, but it shouldn't have slipped as much as it did. They probably win a lot more games if their defense is more consistent. So both Jaden and Finch kind of brought up the defense. The biggest thing from Finch, to an answer to my question about just his overall thoughts on the season, was he brought up just kind of, I think he's kind of pushing back to the woe is me Minnesota sports fan of it all, which certainly I appreciate. That's not something that I particularly enjoy hearing, just because, and this is what Finch said, every team goes through crap. 29 of the 30 teams aren't going to win the title. So while fans are more than welcome to be frustrated by the lack of winning by men's sports in this town, I think just like the woe is me of it all, it's just kind of like, I just kind of tired of it, in the sense of the Wolves did have a good season. They achieved, I think, anyone's reasonable expectations in for the whole season, during the midseason, and the only time they failed was in the Western Conference Finals, and they do need to get better and they do need to improve. But Finch just kind of said, like, all these seasons end like shit. It doesn't matter if you get blown out. It doesn't matter if it's close. It still feels like shit. And I tend to agree. I don't think that that's to take away from kind of the mental lapses they had in Game 5 that allowed them to get blown out. I think that that's something that they need to improve. But to me, it's just like they lost in 5, and it is what it is. They need to get better, and it doesn't matter that other franchises have lost. It doesn't even matter that the Wolves have lost. This team is what it is. He kind of talked about some of the, like, it always seems like a team's going to be a dynasty. I mentioned Boston specifically, but who knows what's going to happen? That's good or bad for the Wolves. It could be good. Who knows if Oklahoma City can replicate what they did this year? Who knows if the Wolves can replicate what they did this year? But personally, I like where the Wolves were at. as much as anyone. It doesn't guarantee them anything, but I like their odds as much as anyone. Lastly, the trio of potential free agents, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Naz Reid, and and Julius Randle, all spoke about their upcoming free agency. They all expressed interest in being back. And I specifically think Julius and Naz were the two that stood out to me. Maybe Julius more than the other ones, as I think Julius would really like to be back in Minnesota. He talked about the food scene again, and just Minnesota being more his speed compared to New York, the hustle and bustle, where I think the kind of the suburban lifestyle of Minnesota is more similar to his Texas childhood than New York was. And he said again, he repeated this was the most meaningful basketball of his career. And I just think if the Wolves want him back, and I do think in general that they will, Julius Randle is likely to. The Wolves will want him back if the contracts make sense. The next, in terms of who I think would like to be back most, is Naz Reid. Talked about the fans and being supported, but maybe the most interesting part of it was he said that they hadn't discussed a potential role, and if he was asked if Rudy and Julius are still on this team and you're kind of projected to be the sixth man, would you still want to be in Minnesota in that case? And he said, I'm not completely ruling that out. It will be a lot to think about for sure, which is interesting. And then he says, answering to if he views himself as a starter, he says, yes, 100%. But if you want to be in a winning, so he does view himself as a starter, but if you want to be in a winning position, sometimes you have to make sacrifices. So I definitely view myself as a starter, but things happen, things change. You never know what's ahead of you until you talk about it and until you go through. So I think it's confirmation that Naz Reid does want to be a starter, but I do think it also reinforces that it's not the end all be all for him. And if the money is right, if certainly coming back to Minnesota is something that will buy you something, it's not completely meaningless, but the Wolves are going to have to pay him his market rate, which is fair enough for everyone. So I do think that those will kind of be the two players the Wolves look to bring back. I think this can be a crazy offseason of. I don't think they're just going to bring back Julius and Naz and run back last year's team with Terrence Shannon and Jalen Clark picking up Nickeil's minutes. I think there's going to be more movement than that for the Wolves, but I guess we'll see. The player that I think coming into the exit interviews was the player that you'd look at for not likely to be back, and certainly the exit interviews kind of reinforce that. When asked, what's your thought about your future, he answers, it's the elephant in the room, so to speak. I haven't gone through it all, which is something all three of them said, which is understandable. I don't think they've really, certainly in the last couple of months, I don't think any of them, it's been the playoffs, so they haven't really thought about it. But returning to his quote, still trying to process this year. I get the chance to be a full-time dad at least for a week before things get crazy, and you've got to go back. But for me, in this moment, the way I see it, it'd be kind of selfish for me to get to that point. All the people around me, now that the season is over, taking the time to give and spread it to my circle and be with them is going to be help for me. Is going to help me for that decision. So I don't think he's really even thought about it, and he says it would have been selfish for him to even think about it before now. But then he said, to a question, is there a pathway back to Minnesota? He said, I'll never burn that bridge. And for me to have this opportunity, I love Minnesota and what the fans have meant to me. What the team has meant to me, this is the only place I've had a real opportunity to play, to be the X factor to be the best version of myself. So I'll definitely say yes. There's no way that I'm going to go into the offseason and X out Minnesota. That'd be crazy. So I think that's very clear what I think we all would assume. Nickeil would really love to be back, but I think also understands the realities of that situation. All right, that's going to be a wrap for me on this one. Exit interviews. We'll be talking with Tim Connolly next week. I'll likely have an article up on Kane Supis, so if you want to read that, based on early next week, whatever Tim Connolly says. I'm sure there'll be plenty interesting from that. But we'll see the timing on that when that happens. But thank you everyone for listening. Leo and I will have a pod up on Monday morning for everyone, going over the season, the OKC series, and possibly the future of this offseason. But thank you everyone for listening. Go Wolves.
Hey, you.